It's an honor to have you. Do you mind if I begin with the questions? That would be awesome.
Go for it.
Okay, I'm going to start with the first one. Let's begin, by the definition of terms. So my understanding is that antifragility is a term for something that goes beyond resilience, perhaps not just surviving, but actually thriving.
Yeah.
So can you help us understand this concept and how it relates to us in these difficult times?
Yeah, so antifragility is actually a term that was coined by Nassim Taleb, who's a professor at New York University. And essentially, what he did was take the concept of resilience a step further. So what is resilience? Resilience is the ability of a material or a person to bounce back. So you have a piece of rubber, you squish it, and it goes back to its original form. You drop the ball, it bounces back to where it was before. That's why we talk about bouncing back. So that's resilience. Anti-fragility is the opposite of fragility. So if fragility is breaking down, anti-fragility is perhaps breaking down, but then reforming in a better place, in a stronger place than it was before. So the ball bouncing back, not to the same level, but actually higher. And you have this anti-fragility term throughout nature. For example, I go to the gym. What am I doing to my muscles? I'm actually breaking them down, quite literally. But then if I rest after a month of training or 6 months of training, I actually become stronger than I was before. That's anti-fragile. Now, our challenge going through these times is, yes, to be resilient, to be able to bounce back. But how about if we take it a step further? How about instead of just bouncing back, we actually cultivate in ourselves stronger muscles, stronger psychological muscles, so that we're better able to deal with the world, with hardship, so that we have a bigger capacity to embrace joy and happiness as well once this is over.
Interesting, fascinating. Okay, so in your teachings on happiness, you often stress giving yourself permission to be human. I'd love it if you would unpack that for us.
Good. I'm so glad you asked this. You see, right now, we're all experiencing extreme emotions and complex emotions. So extreme emotions, extreme anxiety, for example. We're going through a difficult period where we are concerned. We're concerned about our health, our loved ones' health. We're concerned about the financial future, security. So the anxiety levels are very high around the world. At the same time, there are also people who are experiencing gratitude now, deep sense of gratitude. So it's not just painful emotions, it's also the pleasurable set of emotions. I spoke to a friend of mine a while back, and he's sitting in Switzerland, with his wife in quarantine. The kids are outside the home already, and he says to me, and we're on Zoom, right? One-on-one. He comes in closer and he says, Tal, we're happy. And I said to him, why are you whispering? And he said, I feel guilty. And, guilt is associated with gratitude right now. Guilt is associated with positive emotions. So extreme emotions, the painful and the pleasurable ones, and complex emotions. What do we do about this flood of emotions? What we do about it is we give ourselves the permission to be human, to experience the full range of human emotions. Because, if we reject emotions, for example, if I reject my anxiety and I say to myself, Tal, how can you be anxious? You're supposed to be the happiness expert. Anxiety? Well, then the anxiety is only going to intensify. Moreover, if I block painful emotions such as anxiety, such as frustration, such as anger, I'm also blocking pleasurable emotions, because all of our emotions flow through one pipeline, not two pipelines. Golda Meir, back in the 1970s, said, those who don't weep with their whole heart don't laugh with their whole heart either. Two sides of the same coin. So embracing the emotions, whatever they are, the sorrow and the joy. This is the first step of anti-fragility. It's also the first step of learning to deal with the flood of emotions.
You've taught that happiness lies at that intersection between pleasure and meaning. Maybe you can help us understand the process of arriving at that special crossroad, especially with all of these mixed emotions.
Yeah, so the paradox is that in order to experience true happiness, we first need to allow in unhappiness, not reject it, embrace it. And once we embrace the full range of human emotions, once we get to that, but what's the next step? So in many ways, embracing painful emotions, we can look at it as surrendering to whatever emotion comes up. So that's the passive response. What's the active response? Well, there are a few things that we can do. One of the things, perhaps the most important thing, is to find meaning in our activity. Now, Viktor Frankl, in his very important work on man's search for meaning, distinguishes between the meaning of life and the meaning in life. So the meaning of life is, the big picture meaning. Why am I here? And very many people then turn to religion as an answer to the meaning of life, or to some lofty ideal and lofty goal. However, he also says that in order to lead a full and fulfilling life, meaning of life is not always accessible, and it's not always something that we can draw on to alleviate difficulties, hardships, or to become happier. What we also need is a meaning in life. So that would be the small m meaning as opposed to the capital M meaning. And that we can find in our day-to-day activities. Now, it's always important to find the small m meaning in life. It's especially important and possible and attainable these days. So, for example, find meaning in a conversation that we have online with a friend, or a lecture that we attend, or find meaning in making something by ourselves or with the kids, or find meaning in just getting through the day, which is a lot sometimes during these, well, always, but certainly during these times. So finding that small letter M, in addition, and this is active, in addition to the passive accepting and embracing the emotion, the combination puts us in a good place for well-being, all things considered, relatively to the situation, as well as it also poises us for an anti-fragile process once this is over. In other words, for growth.
So are you saying that meaning is one of the causes, if you will, of happiness?
Meaning is an indispensable element of happiness. I would say more generally, if I had to expand beyond meaning, it would be a sense of spiritual well-being. And we gain spiritual well-being by finding a sense of meaning and purpose. Now, as I said, people find it also in religion, of course. However, it's important to keep in mind that what provides us the sense of spirituality is finding a sense of meaning and significance in what we do, whether it's in our religion, whether it's in our work, whether it's in our interactions. So the key element of spirituality is purpose, is meaning.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay, so you've spoken also about the importance of simplifying in the route to happiness. So is that like a Marie Kondo kind of simplification, or something more internal, if you will?
Yeah, no, the internal and the external are connected. So yes, Marie Kondo, by the way, I tried it and didn't make me happy. I actually failed miserably, but there are people who absolutely swear by it. The simplification that I'm talking about is similar. Let me give you an example. So this is research done by Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner in economics, a psychologist, Israeli, taught in Princeton for many years. And the research that he did was fascinating. So this research was done on women, professional women, both in the US and across the Atlantic in Europe. And what he found, he basically was looking at the emotional experiences of these women. And by the way, the results apply as much to men as well. His subject in this case were women. So looking at the emotional experiences of women, professional women, and he looked at how do they feel when they are with their partner, when they are at work, when they are shopping, when they're with their kids, when they're exercising, having lunch, whatever. Really created a gestalt of their whole day. And the most interesting result of this study was that these women did not particularly enjoy spending time with their children. Now, this was surprising. He delved a little bit further, and it wasn't deeper, and it wasn't because these women did not love their children. For most of these women, if not all, the children were the most important part of their lives. So it wasn't that. What was it then? It was that when these women were with their children, they were not really with their children. Meaning they were physically there, but at the same time, they were on the phone or working or texting or thinking about what they have to do later or what they did earlier. So physically they were present, but they weren't really present. And this goes to the point of, you can't have too much of a good thing. So just being with their children would have been great. Just being on the phone with their best friend would have been amazing. Just working, fantastic. But when all these things come together, too much of a good thing. And it's quantity of activities that affects quality of experience.
Please repeat that. Repeat that phrase.
It's when quantity of activities affect quality of experience. So I'll give you another example. Let's say you're listening to your favorite piece of music, whatever it is. And if my favorite piece of music is Whitney Houston's "And I Will Always Love You." Seriously, my favorite song. Maybe we listen to it after. Okay, so you're listening to it, you rate it on eyes closed, focused, rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. It's your favorite, you give it a 10. And then you listen to your second most favorite piece of music. And if your second most favorite is like mine, you're listening to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Pa-pa-pa-pam. And again, eyes closed. And once again, you're asked to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. And you give it a 9. It's not quite Whitney Houston, but Beethoven's pretty good. And then for the ideal, optimal, perfect experience, you take these two pieces of music and you play them together. And what do you get? 19? No, not a 10, not even a 5. It's cacophony, it's noise. And that's modern life for you. Quantity of activities affect quality of experience. We need to simplify. Just listen to Whitney Houston or Beethoven, not to both. Just spend time with your kids when you're with your kids. Just work when you work. And by the way, always important, especially important now when the boundaries between home and work don't exist. So it's important to create boundaries for yourself and to say, kids, I'll be with you, only with you between, these hours in the afternoon. Right now, I have to work and then work. And when you work, even though your bed may be really close to you, don't go there. Stay at work. So creating these boundaries, this is always important. It's certainly important now. This is what I mean by simplify, doing less rather than more at any given point in time.
Tal, I have to tell you, if that was all you said for this last 20 minutes, it would have been Dayenu. It would have been enough. That was
Thank you.
So powerful. I want to ask you something else. So one of your teachings tells us that we're supposed to prioritize our relationships, but how do you do that in this petri dish of isolation, whether you're on your own, because that's like, isolating, or you're spending a bit too much time with your loved ones, if you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, yes. I think everyone, well, most people who are at least, with one other person know, because it doesn't matter how amazing that person is,
right?
There's too much of a good thing. So what do we do when it comes to relationships? So as I mentioned earlier, first of all, boundaries are important. This was last week. I had a terrible day. At work, things weren't going well. I started to really miss traveling, which I do a lot of during normal, whatever that means, times. And I was really feeling down. And at 7 p.m. came, we sat down for dinner. It's one of the rituals that we have every night. And we were supposed to watch a movie after, The Hobbit. And And, I told my, my kids and my wife, I said to them, look, I'm just feeling like a rag. I need time by myself. I'm sorry. I know we set up this time, and I went to my room, gave myself doors closed, give myself the permission to be human, shed a few tears, read my book and fell asleep earlier than I usually do. And, the next day woke up not feeling amazing, but a lot better. So, so it's important to set these boundaries in our relationship. In addition, and this is very important, relationships are the number one predictor of happiness, and they're the number one predictor of health. Now, in the research on it, and there's been a lot of research on it, it doesn't say perfect relationships. These don't exist, right? But what it does say is intimate relationships. Now, intimate relationships can be with a romantic partner. They can also be with extended family. They can also be with your best friend. They can also be with colleagues. Relationships where you feel trusting and trusted, where you care about and are cared for. So these are the kind of relationships that are the building blocks, the most important building blocks of both happiness as well as health, physical health. Now, if we were talking 3 months ago, I would have said, and the distinction we need to make is between real relationships and virtual relationships. Because real relationships, they are the source, they are the secret sauce when it comes to happiness, not virtual. Now, fast forward 3 months, making that distinction is mute, meaningless. I mean, most of our relationships now are virtual. So rather than that distinction between virtual and real relationship, we need another distinction, and that is between superficial and deep relationships. That's a meaningful distinction for today's world. Why? Because I can have a Zoom conversation with a friend for an hour and really talk about what we're going through and share, or a phone conversation for that matter. Or I can just send a few emojis here on WhatsApp, and that's superficial. The former one is deep. And the deep conversation is what will yield all the benefits of great relationships. So the distinction between deep and superficial is the one to make now. When we go back to hopefully normal, then we can have deep and real relationships. But having virtual and superficial relationships, that's a prescription for unhappiness.
What would you say to a person who doesn't seem to have the capacity for a deep relationship or doesn't have anybody to speak to right now? Are there outlets for that emotional reality that you're talking about?
Yeah, one of the, I would say two things. The first thing that I would say is start cultivating one. It's interesting that the people who benefit most from, and again, all this research was done in the past decade, right. The people who potentially benefit most from the potentiality of online relationships are the introverts, the people who have difficulties, forming relationships. So I would say this is a great opportunity right now to start cultivating those relationships. How? Finding outlets where people who have similar interests to you meet. Go on online lectures and forums and start being involved there. And through that, to give it time, relationships will develop. Second, one of the reasons why many people shun away from relationships is because of expectations. If my expectation is that, my relationships will be, or ought to be rather, perfect or conflict-free or a smooth ride, well, these are unrealistic expectations. And when I have these expectations, I will consciously or even just subconsciously actually distance myself from the cultivation of relationships. So I think the first switch has to be here. And that switch is away from the perfect relationship and towards the good enough. Because you know what? Good enough really is good enough. And it's something you can build on and cultivate and develop. But you have to start somewhere.
It sounds to me like the permission to be human is something that has to be extended to somebody else as well, right?
Exactly right. I often, when I talk to to adult populations, and especially when there are couples, I always say, I know what the problem is in your relationship. And, everyone's ears, perk up immediately. You know what? I said, I've been researching this for many years, and I'm going to tell you what the problem is in your relationship. Then I say, the problem in your relationship is that your partner is not perfect. There's another problem, though, in your relationship, and that is that your partner's partner is not perfect either. Permission to be human.
So your newest book is called Happiness, Life-Changing Habits from My Barber. Now, given that we all need to see one literally these days.
Little did I know. Yes.
What did you learn from him figuratively, please?
I know. Yeah. So this is my barber in Ramat Sharon. And, I'd been going to him for a long time. And every time I would go, there'd be a pearl of wisdom. And I would go, walk home from the barber shop smiling and thinking. And I said, I have to write a book about him. And I didn't tell him. And every time I went there, I actually took notes on his wisdom. And after 2 years where I felt I had enough to publish, I asked for his permission, whether I could publish it. Of course, he gave it to me. And, so many pearls of wisdom. I'll just give you one, beyond the fact that he talks about the importance of relationships and, actually two. So here is one. One is his barbershop is just behind a synagogue. So, one day, he's cutting my hair, and an elderly gentleman, in his early 80s comes in, and he says his name, the barber's name is Avi. He said, Avi, it's a real problem. How do we get the young generation to come to shul again? They're not doing it, and I don't know. But then the elderly gentleman says, but there are also benefits to this modern world. And he says, I have this app, and he takes out his smartphone. And he shows Avi an app with, all the Torah is there, and of course the Siddur and Pirkei Avot. And he says, I have this app, which is amazing. And he says to Avi, to my barber, Avi, would you like me to download it for you? This 80-plus-year-old man says it to Avi. And Avi, puts his scissors down, takes this guy by his hand, and they walk outside. And I hear him say, and he said, I don't need an app. I have a direct connection to him. These pearls of wisdom are priceless, a direct connection. And then I thought of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who back in 1936 said, we all have a direct connection to the Almighty. This, of course, got him thrown out of the church in 1836, but he nevertheless said it, almost 200 years before Avi. But two great minds. The other, one other thing that I'd like to share, and this has a lot to do with the work of Momentum. It's about relationships. My favorite word in Hebrew, and Avi highlighted this for me. My favorite word in Hebrew is the word to give. The word to give comes from the root natan. And Natan in Hebrew would be Nun Taf Nun. If you spelled it in Roman letters, it would be Natan. And if you look at the word Natan, it's very unique because it's a palindrome.
Right.
It's symmetrical. It reads left to right and right to left in the same way. This is no coincidence. There is a great deal of wisdom in Hebrew, in a biblical language, and Natan is a biblical word. Where we give Natan, we're given right back. There's a great deal of research to back that up today. And when you create a community of givers, this is the ultimate form of cultivating happiness, and not just cultivating happiness, of spreading happiness.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Who is wise? He who learns from everyone. Okay, so you were such a popular professor at Harvard. I read all about you, and your classes overflowed with students. Everyone wanted to get in. So what do you think it was that struck such a chord with young people about positive psychology and happiness? What do you think was at the root of that?
Yeah, so, I started off, when I started off teaching, I had 8 students in my class, and 2 of them dropped out. which left me with a broken ego. And then the following year, the class grew. And then, you know, by the third year and fourth year, it became the largest class. And the reason is because what students were telling their roommates, their teammates, they were saying that this class changed my life. And, you know, when I created that class, that was my explicit objective. I created a class with the explicit objective to help students lead a happier life. And what I did was the following. I took the research in the field, because it is an academic class and because this is what speaks to me and to so many people. I took the research, the latest research in the field, and merged it with storytelling, and then merged it with applied ideas. Okay, so we're learning a lecture about the importance of giving. Now you have an exercise to go out and commit an extra five acts of kindness. Or we're learning about gratitude. And your homework is every night before going to bed to write down at least 5 things for which you're grateful. Or we're doing the importance of physical exercise. And you have to start exercising on a regular basis because you're going to have to report it. So not 100% of the students did all the assignments fully, but most of them did. And those who did benefited greatly from it. You see, it's all evidence-based. It's based on scientific research. Now, it's not rocket science. It's actually relatively simple to understand. And when you have to, because it's a class, you have to apply it, then it yields all those benefits.
Wow, that so aligns with one of our values at Momentum of taking action. You know, inspiration without perspiration, no concretization, right? So fabulous. Oh, okay, so you're speaking today really largely to a population of mothers and fathers. So what would be your first order of business to increase happiness in family life now during Corona and beyond it?
Yeah. Yes, so beyond that foundation, or related to that foundation of the permission to be human, I would say the following. Let me take it a step back, because I think this is such an important point. So back in the 1970s, Robert Greenleaf was an organizational psychologist who really looked for the essence of great leadership. And he studied leadership, modern leadership, ancient leadership, and he discovered that the best leaders, in his words, the extraordinary leaders, share a characteristic, and that is that they are servant leaders. Servant leaders. They see themselves first and foremost as servants. So he talked actually explicitly about Moses. He talked about how Moses, you know, served his flock and was later identified to serve the people of Israel. He was a servant. He fast forwards this and he says, you know, if you study Jesus, he was a servant too. Fast forward to modern day. And what do we have modern day leadership? We see Gandhi, who was a servant of the people, or Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela, first words out of prison, after 27 years in prison, he turns to the people of South Africa and he says to them the following. He said, "I'm not here as your prophet, I'm here as your servant." And we see it in organizations today. Anita Roddick, who was the founder of The Body Shop, saw herself as the servant of the people. John McKee, who's the founder of Whole Foods, servant leaders. Now, what is the number one characteristic of servant leaders? First of all, the perception, of course, understanding that the organizational chart doesn't look like this, okay? You have the CEO at the top, and then you have the managers and the middle managers and the employees at the bottom of the pyramid. You take this pyramid and you turn it upside down, where the CEO is at the bottom serving the managers who are serving their managers who are serving the employees.
Wow.
The first characteristic of servant leaders, in the words of Robert Greenleaf, listening. Listening first. That is the battle cry of extraordinary leaders. Extraordinary leaders in organizations, extraordinary political leaders, extraordinary leaders at home, i.e. parents. First and foremost, listen. You know, the children who are listened, really listened to, develop to become more self-confident adults, more successful adults, happier adults. And when we're listening, when we're really listening, there are also benefits to us. In other words, it's a win-win. It's like Natan. So first and foremost, listening. Having said that, listening that goes alongside with clear boundaries. You know, a family needs boundaries. Children need boundaries. It's not a democracy. So if you have clear boundaries, for example, you have to be at dinner at 7 o'clock. That's family time. You don't have to talk, but you have to be there. And with that, listening and openly listening, that is the combination that parents need to exemplify, to live today.
You've like blown my mind. Like, really, honestly, I cannot thank you enough. Wow. Thank you from all of us. And there are hundreds and hundreds of us on this call. Thank you for joining us today, truly.